Originalist theory has advanced quite a bit and been refined quite a bit in the last quarter century, but methodology has lagged somewhat behind. And we wanted to, this paper is to try to introduce a tool that can help advance the methodological ball at times. So in trying to get the communicative content of the Constitution to traditional tools that are used, or founding era dictionaries and examples of founding era language. These are good, but inadequate. Founding era dictionaries often don't, and dictionaries in general often don't do semantic context very well. What they're good at is giving us often a range of attested senses of terms at the time, kind of a museum of meaning, so to speak, but context is not their strength. They also don't define phrases, and often the semantic sum of the parts of a word is more than just if you added those up individually. This is the term called compositionality in linguistics. Dictionaries struggle a little bit with polysemy, the multiple senses, in the sense of that they can give often those senses with a few caveats, but they can't tell you what's necessarily ordinary in a given context. And founding era dictionaries tended to lump rather than split senses, meaning they could mask some senses that were actually in play then. Often we have a wrong time frame problem with founding era dictionaries. This isn't just the Samuel Johnson's 35 years before, Noah Webster's 40 years after, which even within that short time frame you can have a linguistic drift. But it's also the issue of they often relied on examples of language usage that were centuries previous, such as the King James Bible or Shakespeare. They also plagiarized each other mercilessly, and so you can also have a time frame problem there in that it might say the dictionary was published in 1770, but it's really relying on a dictionary from 1720, and again, linguistic drift could be missed. They tend to be the works of one or two minds, so they're idiosyncratic. And founding era dictionaries, and really American dictionaries up until around the 1960s when Webster's Third came out, tended to be prescriptive, telling you what the words should mean, what the proper definition is, rather than how language is being used. So you can mitigate this a little bit by looking at samples of founding era language, as originalists tend to do, but often, with some exceptions, Randy Barnett is one of those in some of his work, the sample size there is just too small to really make credible generalizations about the population that they're being sampled from. And of course, you open yourself up to cherry picking. And there's also a tendency to use non-representative examples. The Federalist Papers are great, but that may not quite capture everything from the time frame. So corpus linguistics is a tool to try to get beyond some of those methodological limitations of traditional originalist tools. It's the study of language, naturally occurring language, in bodies of text that are collected together in things called corpora or a corpus. And the theory is that the best way to understand what language means is to see how language is used. The corpus that we use for our paper, the Corpus of Founding Era American English, there's a beta version that exists right now. It's password protected, but if you're interested in it, I can get you that information. You can play around with it. It's still a bit rough. But it covers from 1760 to 1799, and it's about 150 million words. And what's great about it is it's really 3 mini corpora in one. So you have about 50 million words from Founders Papers, the National Archives project, which may some original intent folks may find that a little bit more relevant. You've got around 50 million words from the Evans Early American Imprint series, which is a range of documents of more, well, there's elite, but also more ordinary folks in that. So perhaps original public meaning folks might find that more interesting. And then you have Hein Online documents, and for those legal materials, perhaps original methods or even languages law folks might find that more relevant. And of course, the nice thing about combining all 3 is that sometimes we don't know whether something's a legal term of art or an ordinary meaning, and to be able to compare across those can be helpful. So let me just real quick talk about some of the tools that can give us some leverage on some of the questions that we may have that are in a corpus. One is just straight up frequency data, and sometimes that tool is just more for exploration than necessarily helping us figure out meaning. But on page 27 of the paper, we have an example of a very hotly debated constitutional clause, the domestic violence clause. And we show that over the time period, you can see that for the first 120 years or 220 years or so, that the usage of the term domestic violence, at least in ordinary American English, seems to be rather steady but small. And then in the 1980s, something happens. We don't know what that is that happens, but something's going on. And so based off of that, we decided to look at what are called collocates. Those are just word neighbors. And this is based off of a linguist named Colin Firth, who in the 1950s came to this stunning realization that a word could be known by its associates. Apparently, he didn't know about nocitoriosis. Anyway, collocates just look at words that co-occur in the same semantic environment. So if you look on page 27 to 28, we looked at the collocates of domestic violence in this long early period of time when they weren't, the term wasn't used very much, compared to this more recent period of time when usage really took off. And you can see a really dramatic difference in the collocates. So in the early period of time, we have things like invasion, suppress, legislature, insurrection, states, that all kind of point towards an insurrection sense, which I think most people would say that's the sense of the Constitution. And then in the later period, we have things like women, abused, killings, victims, battered, police. So we see more of a family abuse sense. So the collocate patterns there seem to point to different senses in these time periods. And then what I think of as the bread and butter of corpus analysis, which is also the most qualitative aspect of it and the hardest to do as far as massive reading and work, is to try to classify the senses that you're finding. And so looking at the senses on page 29, we found in the early period, overwhelmingly domestic violence meant the insurrection sense, and in this recent period, it's the family abuse sense. Now, there's other tools. On page 39, again, this is where frequency data across corpora can be helpful. So looking at public use, we see that it occurs 6 times as often in legal materials than it does in ordinary materials. So that's interesting. Maybe that points toward it being some kind of legal term of art. That in and of itself may not be enough to determine that, but it points in that direction. So frequency across corpora can be helpful. On page 33, we look at, in commerce, we're looking at collocates. And besides just doing a collocate search, we then started thinking about doing collocates of the synonyms of commerce, or at least some of the senses of commerce. So there's a trade sense. There's also, some people would argue, a production or manufacturing sense. And looking at those, we could see that commerce shared a lot more of the same collocates with trade than it did with manufacturing. Weak evidence, but still points towards potentially commerce having more of a trade sense meaning. On page 36 to 37, we looked at what are called clusters or engrams. This is where you look for, words tend to occur in certain patterns, and those patterns can take on meanings. In the law, we sometimes refer to things like this called doublets or triplets. Linguists call them binomials or multinomials. And here we have agriculture, commerce, and blank. So that shows up 49 times in the corpus. And about 2/3 of that time, that third term is manufactures. And then, again, we looked at commerce in the sense distribution as well. So just a couple quick caveats, right? So this tool is not always appropriate. It doesn't really probably help with structural or syntactic ambiguity. So this is not a panacea. This is not a one-size-fits-all. And sometimes it doesn't always provide clear answers. I think, in the paper, The Natural Born just was too ambiguous to figure out what was going on there. And so in that instance, you're going to have to turn to other methodologies and tools. But while not perfect, it's progress over the tools we have been using to try to get at this threshold inquiry of what is the communicative content of the Constitution.